This video is on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I'm Peter Carter, and I am only narrating this video. All of the text and the images are obtained from the very thorough website of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and I'm hoping to support and promote this by putting this video together and pointing out, as I do, that this is the only way to go. The Fossil Fuel Treaty is the only way that we have to make progress to go. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty, most importantly, calls for the end of the era of coal, oil, and gas, fast, fairly, and forever. Now, I've not come across an expression of the fossil fuel transition phase-out as accurate as this one: fast, fair, and forever, and to end the era of fossil fuels. This is the 2023 Civil Society Equity Review. I had not seen this, and it's in the Fossil Fuel Treaty website, and it's good and very important. I found that it's endorsed by virtually all civil society organizations. It calls, this review calls for an equitable phase-out of fossil fuel extraction and for a fair and rapid fossil fuel phase-out. And so these are the key findings of that report. The Fossil Fuel Treaty people recognize that the United Nations climate negotiations are set up to fail. They express this on the headline of this page: consensus is not required to make progress. They're set up to fail, and they have failed for 30 years. These conferences are under the United Nations 1992 Climate Change Convention. They're set up to fail because of a perverse interpretation of consensus, that being unanimity. This is absolutely unique to the climate change negotiations. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty says the consensus model, based on decision making, leads to the lowest common denominator because all nation states have to agree to it, and of course fossil fuel producing states will not agree to it because by their non-agreement they're sabotaging and preventing the negotiations and action to continue. So all nations have to agree on a decision, and this gives fossil fuel promoter nations a veto in effect. There's a lot of increasing industry influence, fossil fuel industry influence at these COPs. The COPs are the conferences of the parties to the 1992 convention, and also recently the COPs have been used to promote unproven and unreliable technologies, namely carbon capture and storage, to be pushed into the process of the convention negotiations. So these are my big reasons why the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a must. Firstly, the UN negotiating process is set up to fail. There's been no reform on that over the 30 years. Vulnerable countries require an equitable voice and influence. The climate negotiations do not give this. The Fossil Fuel Treaty process does give this. Next, world civil society NGOs have united under the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and that's a huge achievement by the initiators and leaders of this Fossil Fuel Treaty. Next, the progress on climate change requires a revolution of values, and that is in the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty is the only place where you're going to find that. Finally, the Fossil Fuel Treaty is already a success. Now, this is the only part that is not from the website of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Just a quick glance at the state of the climate emergency, which of course is rapidly getting worse. So, as most people may have heard, we have accelerating greenhouse gas concentrations and accelerating global warming. These time series go from 1850 to 2024. There's the global temperature increase. So there's atmospheric CO2 accelerating all the way, absolutely soaring. Methane also accelerating. Nitrous oxide also accelerating. More details. And finally, of course, emissions. These are global fossil fuel CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2024, shooting up. record global emissions in 2024. And these are the global greenhouse gas emissions that include CO2 and also methane and nitrous oxide. And you can see that this is very similar. This is rapidly soaring up this is rapidly soaring upwards from 1990 to 2023. So you can see how vitally important a survival imperative, a process is that can work to produce agreements amongst the nations who do want to see a phase out and transition from fossil fuel energy, and that actually is the majority of the nations. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty, it's a bold project to phase out fossil fuels and support a global just transition. From the website, the Fossil Fuel Treaty goals: to stop fossil fuel expansion immediately, to wind down fossil fuel production, and to ensure the just transition. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty then is based on a model of the Nuclear Weapons Treaty going back to 1970, and this was eventually a successful negotiation to stop the rapid increase of nuclear weapons that was the arms race between the US basically and the USSR at that time, and the increasing risk of nuclear war, nuclear catastrophe. And so this was the model for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So the text on the side here points out that oil, gas, and coal are the root cause of the climate crisis, and despite the destructive reality of fossil fuels, as well as the constant warnings of science, there is no binding mechanism to limit their production. There is not even a plan to limit their production. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty points out that the Paris Agreement, important as it is, does not reference fossil fuels once. Fossil fuels are not mentioned throughout the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement has failed to constrain production. So the Paris Treaty is not, and will not lead to the termination of the fossil fuel era. This then is the doomsday clock, this annual doomsday clock by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, published January 2025. The doomsday clock was set at 89 seconds to midnight, the closest ever it has been to human extinction. So yes, we are looking at a risk of to our survival. And the very thorough explanation in the bulletin was that humanity is edging closer to catastrophe. This is the closest it's ever been, and the factors including in the reason include nuclear weapons and the climate crisis. The climate crisis has been included in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for several years. So here's a repeat on the Paris Agreement that doesn't reference fossil fuels. This shows the UN Climate Secretariat on their site, what is the Paris Agreement. Now the important thing here, on a quotation from the Fossil Fuel Treaty site, comes from the United Nations Secretariat, in which, explaining the Paris Agreement, the Secretariat states that to limit global warming, greenhouse gas emissions must peak before 2025 at the latest, and decline 43% by 2030. Now there, the UN Climate Secretariat is quoting from the 6th assessment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yes, I'm making this video in 2025, and emissions had to be in decline by now. So Here's another little list I put together on the fossil fuel treaty. Is the only way we have to get global emissions going down, as the science demands. Only the fossil fuel treaty has all the affected solutions without any of the false solutions. Climate change is accelerating, making an end to fossil fuel today's survival imperative. So the fossil fuel treaty was launched September 2020, and it was launched under the New York City Climate Week with a good quote, a good theme: the international cooperation to align fossil fuel production with a 1.5 degrees C world. Here's a illustration of the fossil fuel treaty timeline. I won't go into it, it's very detailed. On its launch, 101 Nobel laureates supported, endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. Academics also support the fossil fuel treaty. There are specific supportive papers, one of 2022 entitled Building a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Key Elements, and then another one, 2022 also, Why We Need a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it has the support of science and of scientists. It also has the support of the World Economic Forum. This is a quote from the Forum of 2021, and their headline is, "This is why we need the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty." And of course they explain. This time series, this graph, is very important, and it shows that 120% more fossil fuel production is planned than would allow for a 1.5 degrees C limit. And you'll see that global production as well as global emissions has to go into decline here by 2020. The sixth assessment of the IPCC, their deadline for emissions to decline was put as 2020 to 2025, and then the quote at the very latest. But it's always been 2020. This is another one. It shows that 70% more fossil fuels are planned than the 2 degree C limit. And the 2 degree C is global climate planet catastrophe. This is taken from the UNEP production gap report. UNEP, for a longer period of time, has also had an annual gap report on emissions. The number of annual climate conferences has increased now to 30 years, and atmospheric CO2, which you see here, is increasing at an accelerating rate. There's atmospheric CO2, and so is global warming, increasing at an accelerating rate, as these climate stripes show. I mentioned that there needs to be a transformation in values and ideals, and this is in, and only in, the Fossil Fuel Treaty. This is a project that they did entitled Developing Values and Ideals for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty report. And they had all the right stuff in the report. Here is an illustration from their consultation report, and all the ethical values are there: right to life, right to health, rights of nature, public good, intergenerational rights, reductions in conflict, corporate accountability, workers' rights, social protection, anti-colonial principles, land access, and procedural justice. Going back to the start of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, fossil fuels as weapons of mass destruction, similar to the nuclear arms race, and then how do we phase them out? This is from a meeting in London of October 2022. Climate change, like nuclear weapons, is a major global threat, with coal, oil, and gas responsible for 86% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the past decade. Bold and immediate action is being demanded by the growing coalition of subnational, national, and NGO actors led by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. One of the reasons why I'm narrating this video is there's not nearly enough awareness of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. This is an illustration from the fossil fuel treaty. Fueling failure. My comment is that fossil fuels are wrecking everything. So this is how oil, coal, and gas are driving climate change and sabotaging the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is all, as I say, from the website of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Stop fossil fuels fueling conflict. For this report, the Fossil Fuel Treaty stopped fossil fuels from fueling conflict. Why the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is an essential climate tool for peace. And as is well known, climate change is a driver of conflict. And this is interesting. In the International Energy Agency, in 2021, in their plan, they say there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in the IEA net zero pathway. The International Energy Agency is the agency that was set up long ago to keep the oil flowing around the world. The health community supports a managed phase out of fossil fuels and supports the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this is all down in some detail there. And it's also supported by the WHO, the World Health Organization. The Fossil Fuel Treaty website has a lot of science for people to look at in their briefings, and this is a collection of their briefings that are very thorough and accurate. Here the treaty mentions nature-based solutions. Nature restoration is not a substitute for steep emissions reductions. Yes, they have to be worked on, but without a rapid decline, a phase out of fossil fuels, nothing's going to work. Another interesting point is that other researchers suggested that 90% of rainforest carbon offsets do not represent genuine carbon reduction. Most importantly, the Fossil Fuel Treaty has fossil fuel air pollution in it. In 2018, an estimated 8.7 million people died prematurely due to fossil fuel air pollution. That's specifically to air pollution from fossil fuels, which is highly toxic. So this is more than enough reason for the world to demand that fossil fuels are rapidly phased out. This is an annual death rate of over 8 million people a year. Children, they mention, are disproportionately affected by air pollution, and children are disproportionately affected by all impacts of global climate change. So transitioning away from fossil fuels is essential to curb air pollution, health harms, and lead to safe, and this applies to every region to some extent, by the way. Halting deforestation is an important solution to global warming, no question about that, as well as the essential solution on the biodiversity, the nature emergency. But reducing land use emissions by halting deforestation contributes to reducing temperatures, but only slightly. So none of these good ideas can possibly work without the rapid phase out of fossil fuels. You're getting the impression why the Fossil Fuel Treaty has everything right, and everything that is not right, that doesn't work. They point out that this isn't enough. The famous net zero buzzword zero. You're getting the impression why the Fossil Fuel Treaty has everything right, and everything that is not right, that doesn't work. They point out that this isn't enough. Allow for the continued use of fossil fuels. So specifically, the net zero plan approach allows fossil fuel combustion to continue. They have a very good article, a very good section on fossil fuel subsidies. We must stop subsidizing fossil fuels and tax them instead. And this article proposes a shipping levy as one way of doing that. World fossil fuel subsidies amount to $7 trillion direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies in 2022. And this has been worked out by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, no less. And they point out that the subsidies are actually increasing. The IMF, in their report, also explains that stopping subsidies has a very big, rapid effect on reducing emissions.
Dinner. Sorry, lovey, sorry. Sorry, dinner.